Hi, this is Roger, thanks for dropping by and welcome to part 2 of the final Project Orchids updates, and this part is just Dendrobiums. Bit of an assortment in there, from winter resters to alatoria and other things. In most cases my Dendrobiums this year have done quite well and I'm overall quite pleased, but in amongst them there are some tragedies, shall we say, hanging in by the skin of their teeth and all that sort of stuff. So let's get going with part 2. Okay, first up then we've got Dendrobium alexandrae. This is a latoria type species. I bought this in March 2017 as a relatively small plant. It grew a couple of canes in its early years, and last December it was basically doing nothing except that we had 2 nice buds coming. I'm not sure whether that was its first set of blooms for me. I think it might have been, but I was looking forward to this because I hadn't seen buds that sort of shape or colouring before, and as a latoria type I thought these buds are quite large. So I was looking forward to something happening on this. It was in quite a small pot, but potted, not mounted. So let's see what we had in February then. So by the time we got to February we had 2 stunning blooms, and I really was quite gobsmacked with these. These really are exceptional blooms, both the coloration and just the shape. So I was well pleased with that, and following its blooming sometime in April it was repotted, and so once we got to May it hadn't really done anything. It had sort of just stopped basically. Nothing was wrong with it. It put up with the heat wave, kept its leaves, all that sort of thing, but it wasn't really growing. When we got to September, quite honestly, it was looking exactly the same, albeit some of the oldest leaves on the tiny little pseudobulbs had dropped off. But apart from that, it was pretty static. It hadn't really done much. So let's see what it looks like today. Well, this Dendrobium, out of all my latorias, is the one that's been successful. The others have suffered badly. They are recovering, but this one didn't go down with the rest, and it turns out that this one comes from higher elevations, so it would naturally be a cooler grower, which implies it should have gone down even worse in the heat wave, and yet it didn't. Anyway, it's the one that stayed in the pot. It's grown a very good root system in that pot. I've got no plans on disturbing it in the near future, and we're back in bloom again. Worth noting that both of these canes have already bloomed once. This is their second spike out of the same place on the cane, and this smaller cane's also bloomed down here. So this one's doing well. I'm pleased with this. As I say, it's also one of my favourite latorias on the grounds it's just so unusual. You know, these blooms are just stunning. It's not just their colours, it's their shape and the incredible patterning on the rear of the blooms. They have a tendency to hang downwards, so if you're viewing from above, you know, you get to see the spotting on the back, but you need to come round to the front to see the colours in the lip. You've got beautiful purple edging on the outside of the lip, and then this gorgeous veining and spotting on the inside. So yeah, one of my better ones and doing well at the moment. So that goes on into next year looking good. Right, next up, Dendrobium loddigesii. This is one of the true winter resters. This was got in March 2017 from Speciotic Plants. As a reasonable sized plant, I was quite pleased with it when I got it, and through that season it grew well, put on quite a lot of new growth. I was well pleased. But nonetheless, it was a difficult plant to accommodate. It has a mat forming habit, so it will often be found growing on tops of branches or in forks in trees, and the canes arch over and have a tendency to produce keikis towards the end of the canes, which then root and form new plants in their own right effectively. So I mounted it, but I was aware that it was probably going to try and get away from the mount. But nonetheless, I was sort of quite pleased with its progress through the previous season. Once we got to February, in the middle of its rest at this point, so not getting any feed at all and very little water, and quite honestly it hadn't dropped as many leaves as I was expecting, but it had dropped quite a few, so sort of dormant at this stage really. And when we got to May, it really was doing its party trick. It had bloomed, it had done all that, and you can see the keikis are coming out all over the place, and very few of them were close enough to the mount to actually take root. So I was sort of wondering what to do, and I decided that the keikis were going to come off, and they got mounted separately as quite small keikis, but a good number of them. The idea being to grow a new plant from all of those keikis. So let's see where we are today. Right, so the loddigesii, we've got the main plant here in full rest at the moment. Most of the leaves have dropped, certainly on this new growth. There's only one left, and quite a few of the others have gone. I'm not quite sure where blooms will be on here. These sort of canes aren't going to bloom. These are the oldest, and ones like this have already bloomed. And I mean, basically this is a little new growth, this is a good new growth, and these are effectively keikis, but nonetheless are classed as new growth. So we could get blooms around the top here and probably there, and not in many other places. The problem being that if a node produces a keiki, then it can't produce a bloom. That's its lot. It does one or the other. And this one produced a lot, and here they all are. Now these are not getting rested in any shape or form. They are allowed to completely dry in between watering, but they're getting watered and fed through the winter. There's no point in resting those. If they want to grow, then I'm happy for them to get on with it. But looking at the apex of most of the canes, they don't seem to have many signs of continuous growth at the moment, so they probably are slowing down. And then these should all shoot out again in the spring and hopefully grow on quite quickly, and with a mass of new growths on here, the following year we should get a mass blooming, or it might have to wait till the year after. We shall see. So that's the state of play with these two. This didn't grow very well this year compared with the year before, but as I said, it decided to chuck out a mass of keikis, and I think that's just slowed it down. It put energy into those instead of new growths, if you see what I mean, and then when they were removed it seemed to stall. But we'll see what it does next year. You know, I mean, it's still a valid plant. It should still have some blooms on. Late spring I think for this one, and then we'll see how these grow on next year. So in theory this may become the main plant one day, and this one could be to go. We shall see. But that's the state of play with that one. Pleased with these keikis, the way they've rooted and taken hold, so those should push on next spring when the warmer temperatures come, if the rain stops perhaps. And on to Mr. Hairy, quite a few people's favourites this one, tarantula legs, Dendrobium senile. Now this plant was bought in Malvern in 2017, so that would have been June, to replace the one I lost, and it took me a while to work out why I lost it. I always thought this was a true winter rester, and the previous plant's demise was to go up in the spare bedroom, lose all its humidity in the air and not get watered. So it decided to turn up its toes basically and died. It took me a while to work out, apart from the lack of humidity, what I was really doing wrong. This isn't really a true winter rester. This took a while to sort of figure out, really, more by trial and error. But the plant I got home from Malvern turned out to not be a plant, but actually several plants. So they were mounted up together on a single mount, and at the end of that season it was looking quite good. Moving on to February, again, new growths were still progressing in February, so it was obvious it didn't want to rest, if you see what I mean. It was still growing, and it grew slowly, but it carried on growing through the winter. Once we got to May, we'd got some nice growths going on here, and some good strong new canes, large new canes. One of which in May decided to pretend it was autumn and start yellowing its leaves, which was a trifle worrying at the time. But nonetheless, once we got to September, a few more leaves had dropped, a few more were turning yellow, but the plant was still growing. So at this point I had mature canes and actively growing new growths along with some good new roots. So Mr. Hairy, I've decided in my environment, doesn't get a proper winter rest. It's just simply by looking at the plant. I mean, I've still got new growths pushing out on this in the middle of winter. It would be silly to force it into a dormant period and stall those growths. So I wouldn't say it gets watered thoroughly, but it's kept ticking over. And we do have some buds. There's more than that one, there's more. Yeah, there's one at the top of the cane in the centre shot, just under the leaf that's about to drop, and then another one on the cane to the left with the yellowing leaves. I suspect that cane now to the right of the shot, the larger one, may well produce a bud or two as well. We'll see. That cane has actually produced a bloom. You can see where it not only produced a spike, but it also produced a root from the same place. They do things like that sometimes. So this one is being grown on slowly and carefully. There's no way I want the roots to end up being soggy and staying wet for any length of time, so it just gets a small amount of water in the winter with a bit of feed. It is growing, yeah, low levels obviously, and it's just ticking over. But that is an odd time of year for this to be producing buds, I must admit. But then I still don't think this has settled down into a regular growth pattern yet, because it keeps pushing out new growths. It doesn't sort of have, okay, it's spring, let's grow now, and then when we get to autumn, let's stop. It doesn't do that. It seems to push out new growths as and when it pleases at the moment. So maybe it still hasn't settled into my environment, you know. So, but we shall see. But we should get some blooms. They're a long way off. The spikes do take quite a long time to grow and form the buds. But we do have the nubbins, so we do have some signs of blooms to come. And they are quite stunning. So, and they last well as well, and fragrant. It's got a lot going for it, this. And obviously, as these larger canes are dropping their leaves, we should have the true tarantula look soon, with the hairy legs. Anyway, these are classed as not too easy to grow. They're a plant that just seems to keel over for no apparent reason in people's collections. And I've heard it from quite a few good growers that, you know, they kept it going for a couple of years and then it just keeled over for some reason and they never knew why. So I'm just pleased to keep it going, which it seems to be doing okay at the moment. So pleased with this one. Now this one came out of the big box, basically, from Beatrix. One I'd never heard of before at the time. That would have been late February, possibly the beginning of March 2018. So basically this one in December last year this was the end of its first season with me, and I got 2 blooms on it, and they weren't right. I thought, well, perhaps the plant's misnamed. So I did a bit of work, and it is highly likely that the name of the plant is correct, but this is an albiform because it had none of the markings on the blooms that I was expecting. As such, the blooms were a little disappointing, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I've got a feeling this is on the list of plants to go to somebody else, because it's not a bad plant, don't get me wrong. The blooms just weren't what I was expecting, and they don't do much for me. And with the rationalisation that I'm doing, that bit's quite important. So yeah, I mean, somebody will be getting a good plant, don't get me wrong. So that was its first blooming, and then into February we had a couple of little new growths there somewhere, and it was starting to push out some extra roots. It had already got quite a good root system on the mount, but it was deciding to chuck some out the front of the plant to become aerial at this point in time. And once we got to May, it had continued. There was still more roots heading out like that. We'd had a new growth that effectively failed. That's just to the left of the hook. You can see the leaf's discoloured, and it's only got a single leaf at the apex. They should have 2. So it looked like it was going downhill. And when we got to September, it was definitely looking a bit sorry for itself, and I don't know, and I still don't know, at what point it's supposed to drop its leaves. So we better have a look and see how it is today. Right, so this may be the last time this gets filmed until such time as I film the plants to go to other people. The reason this one's on the list to go is shown at the beginning of this section. When it actually bloomed, it's a semi-alba or alba form, which is not what I wanted. In some plants, an alba form is incredibly rare, and they're prized as prized possessions. But, when you produce seeds from the species, you will occasionally get an alba form. And I'm not sure, I expect somebody will write me an essay on it, but even if you've got 2 alba forms in amongst your seedlings when they finally get to blooming, and you reproduce seed from those 2 albas, you've still got no guarantee you're going to get some more. It just seems to be something that happens, and in this particular case it's not what I wanted. I didn't buy the alba form, but I bought an unbloomed plant that had been grown on from a seedling. I mean, it's obvious this has gone from a seedling, from the tiny little pseudo bulbs at the base, seeing the bulbs get bigger and bigger. Yeah. Now this is another one that's got these marks on the leaves, and going back to the Sunday morning chat, which is not part of this subject but it's relevant, and it's relevant for the next one I'm going to look at as well. A lot of people said the pitting on the Arangus was probably cold damage. Well, I had a good read up on that particular Arangus. That's classed as intermediate, and depending on where you look, the lowest nighttime temperature for intermediate does vary a bit from place to place, but a lot of places show it as 10 degrees minimum nighttime temperature. Some places show it as 13, and some in between. Well, bearing in mind the lowest temperature in here is 13, and it's only in the last month or so that's occurred, I'm beginning to wonder whether this is cold damage. And the next thing on the list would be too much light. Now with the Arangus that's possible, because that is a shade lover. Yeah, that does grow in evergreen forest low down. So that's not subject to bright light. And this one, given where it was earlier in the year, may have the same problem. Notice these are old leaves. It does drop its leaves on canes. There are some completely leafless canes on there, so they do go eventually on the older canes, and these are old canes. But we've got a new growth here and a new growth here. So it is actually growing. Actually, there's another one in the middle as well. But also, if you look at this one, that's actually a spike. So it looks like we may see some blooms again before it goes.
I don't imagine it's going to revert from an alba form to the true form. That doesn't happen. But it would have been nice if that had been the regular one, as it's I got it because I really liked the blooms and they last well and it had lots going for it. But I'm just not so keen on that alba form personally. As I said, for some people it might be treasured as a rarity, but it will go eventually. It's not staying with me, but it's coming back into growth despite it being winter, so I think it's going to push on. It's got a good root system. It's established a root system all over that mount, all round the back, and some aerial ones, so it's capable of growing on into a good sized plant. And yeah, it'll be for somebody else to grow on as and when the time comes. But as far as it growing this year, it did have a period where it stalled and then it sort of got going again, so it seems to be doing okay now.
Dendrobium hibiki was bought at the Wessex Orchid Society's Autumn Show 2017, so that would have been October, and I got that from Peter White. He had quite a lot, and I was the idiot who bought the one that wasn't in bloom because it looked the better plant, or it certainly did to me. It was mounted early 2018 and it bloomed during that summer, so when we got to December last year, the blooms had gone and it was in the process of producing new growths. One very large one off to the left there, remember that, that's a bit special, and some others pushing out in various places. I was a little worried because the back of some of the leaves had marks on that looked like spider mite, but there were no traces of them, and it was treated just in case, but the markings were unusual. And they hadn't sort of migrated onto the front of the plant, so I wasn't that worried at the time. And there certainly was no sign of bugs. I couldn't find any, even with the strong magnifying glass. There was no sign of anything, so I was happy to just let it run at that point. Once we got to February, you can see some of the new growths have pushed on quite nicely out to the right hand side. The large one sticking out to the left pointing upwards was still progressing, and everything still looked okay. But if you look at the leaf that's upside down at the very bottom, you can see the marks. And then when we get into May, the demise of that large cane top left becomes apparent. It just failed. The undersides and top sides of the leaves had strange markings on them. The growing tip just rotted. The whole cane failed. And there it is gone. But nonetheless, we got blooms. So by the time we got into September, the new growths out to the right had progressed on quite well. We got blooms on the lower canes and a good smattering of blooms. So let's look at this one today. Okay, so the Dendrobium hibiki has problems, still as yet unknown. If you remember at the start of the sequence of stills, this lovely big new growth just failed miserably, and I chopped it off as a consequence. Now we've got a new growth here pushing on, same problem, yeah? And on some of these leaves down here, they've got markings on the back. Now these markings do look like spider mites, but these leaves have been on it since I got the plant. And as I've said before, there is no sign of spider mites on any of my plants. But nonetheless, what's happening with this one is this new growth pushed out sideways. That's lost its top leaf, and it looks like the next one's going to go. And then we've got a new growth out to the left there. It's got marks on the leaves. Another new growth, well, that's actually a kiki down there, but if you look at those two new growths, they are far from happy. And the whole plant is not happy. There's something fundamentally wrong with this. Let's see if I can get it up a bit, or I can get at it. So at the moment, we've got a new growth round here that's looking good. Leaves on that growth are fine. The leaves on this growth, they're starting to show the marks. There is something wrong with this plant. It's not growing clean.
and I've still yet to find out why. Now this new growth has marks on that leaf. It's showing signs here, but it's still growing. It's got another leaf to come. So, I don't know what to say about it, but it's not a happy plant. It's difficult to say why. Well, for me it's impossible, because I don't know. It's coming to the end of its blooms now. It's been in bloom a nice long time. It certainly bloomed well, but yeah, we have got blooms fading and dropping now. This is probably the last cluster. Even that's got... So blooms are going, and all I can do with this is just see what happens. But again, given the varieties of Dendrobium that have gone into this, this shouldn't worry too much about cooler temperatures. So again, what's the alternative? Alternative is high light and just catching it. And that's going to be especially on younger growth. It's more tender and soft, yeah? And it might explain why this little growth out here is doing fine. And so's this one. It's because they're pushing on now that the light levels are lower. It might be interesting to see what this one does with its latest leaves. Again, the light levels are down now. And it's in a position where the grow lights aren't going to affect it to any great extent, because it's just too far away from them. So although they light it up, they're not close enough to be doing light damage, nowhere near. So we'll just have to see how it progresses and what it does next year, really. It's got good roots. It's certainly not lack of roots. It's pushed roots right up through the moss, out the sides. Loads of roots on the inside there, pushing down. It's got roots. So, a conundrum, that's all I can say. Other people that bought... Noise I'm getting this morning. I've had lorries parked outside with their engine running and the radio blasting. I've had dogs barking, I've had seagulls, I've had the lot. And it's continuing to rain all day again. So noise levels. So it's difficult to know, but I know at least 3 other people bought exactly the same plant from the same place at exactly the same time as me. And they haven't got the problem. Or they're not admitting to it. Let's put it that way. So I'll just have to see how this progresses once we get into back into the growing season and see what it does. As I say, it's bloomed well this year. It certainly did, and it did the year before. So we shall have to wait and see.
Another one of the true winter resters, Dendrobium aphyllum. This came from Alberto in Italy when he gave up his collection as a kiki, albeit one hell of a big sized kiki, but that's what it was. And it was mounted immediately. It actually arrived in November 2017, and a plant that didn't matter if it got transplanted in the cold, because it would have been resting anyway. Anyway, it was promptly mounted, and at the end of 2018 it had grown a good cane. I was quite pleased with that, considering I started out with a kiki with virtually no leaves on. It was just a matter of wondering, having grown a nice new growth, that's all it had. But nonetheless the cane was virtually the same size as the one that it arrived with, and I thought, you know, should I really fully rest this? And I thought, well, it's not growing, so there's no point in trying to grow it on through the winter. It's stopped growing, so there's absolutely no point. So I decided to rest it along with the others that I've got. It is a truly deciduous one, so it does need that rest. That's part of its life cycle. It's a bit of a giveaway when all the leaves fall off in the autumn, isn't it? You know. But anyway, in December, this one still had quite a few of its leaves. It hadn't actually dropped them yet, which I thought was a little unusual, but you know, it's a new plant relatively into the winter. By the time we got to February, it was behaving itself, and it had dumped virtually all of its leaves. A couple hanging in there, just about. They probably could have been helped off if I'd been that way inclined. So now it was a matter of, is it going to bloom or is it going to come back into growth? And basically it did bloom. Pictures on the right. And by the time we got to May, it had started its new growths, and I thought that was a bit late in the season to be starting them, so it might be that I perhaps need to start feeding and watering a bit earlier. You know, those have got a lot of growing to do. Well, by the time we got to September, the growing had been done, and quite honestly I was impressed. To get that much growth on what is not much more than a kiki from May to September is pretty good going. So let's see where we are now as it dropped its leaves.
I'm having to stand a long way away to at least get a shot of the whole plant before we start looking at this in closer detail. The Dendrobium aphyllum is behaving exactly as it should. Nothing unexpected, apart from the fact halfway through the year it did try and start a new growth, which didn't get very far, quite honestly. But it's from a place on the plant. If you look, the main area of growth is here. That's where the new canes have come from, and this has started towards the back of the plant. That may mean that there's a growth point there now, and when we get to the spring, a decent sized cane may come out from this area, which I wasn't expecting because that's the oldest canes there. But the two new canes that grew this year, two instead of one, they've both reached a good length. Yeah, they've both finished growing now. This is being rested, so it gets water occasionally, but certainly not much, and no feed, and no signs of the cane shriveling yet. But it's just doing autumn at the moment, in the middle of winter. It's just starting to yellow the leaves. In another month or so, probably over half the leaves will be gone, and then as we head to February, they'll probably all be gone. There might be the odd one or two hanging on, but it's in the process of dumping its leaves now. It is annually deciduous. I've always said with these types of orchids, if you didn't know, this would be incredibly worrying when you see all your leaves turning yellow and dropping off. And on some of the deciduous plants it can happen very quickly. You know, literally over a period of a couple of weeks they all turn yellow and fall off. It's very worrying if you didn't know it was going to happen. So we should get a good blooming on this, on the two new canes. It's not going to bloom anywhere else. It already has. And these types of orchids very rarely bloom again on the same cane unless it had a poor blooming that year and only used some of the nodes, in which case the following year it might pick up on a few of the nodes that it missed out the year before, but it's not often it does that. It tends to bloom the following year on the previous year's new growths. So we should get blooms on both of these canes in the new year. Something to look forward to.
Now this nobly type, Prima Donna, has a history. A few years earlier it got second best in the Dendrobium class, and the previous year it had got best hybrid in show at the Wessex Orchid Society. That was then, this was now. So in December, what had actually happened prior to that was it was split, and quite honestly the larger part went to somebody else and I kept a smaller part. And in addition to that, at some point, either before this or after, I can't remember, another piece got ripped off and sent to INSA. So the plant was getting smaller and smaller from what was a specimen-sized plant. But as it was going into winter, last December, the new growths hadn't finished properly, and it was probably going to bloom in places, but I wasn't quite sure where. So a bit of a demise really from what was quite a showpiece into what was left. The idea being to grow it on again. You know, not start from scratch as such. That's still not a bad sized plant, but you know, probably only about a third of what it once was. So by the time we got to February, we were basically blooming on older canes in places that hadn't bloomed before. You can see a couple of buds just opening, and top left a couple of buds sticking out the top there. So we did get it to bloom in February, but not a mass blooming. By the time we got to May, it had done all that, finished all its blooms, and we had a couple of new growths pushing on, but they were not pushing on as well as they ought to. And I think it's just, you know, the time it got repotted and split, it wasn't fully recovered as such. By the time we got to September, the growths had pushed on a bit more, but I'd already realised there was no way they were going to reach full size during that year. So literally I'm going to have to wait till next spring and the new growths come. But let's have a look and see how it is now. And the last one is my nobly type Prima Donna, finished growing for the year now, currently being rested to a degree. I don't fully rest my noblies. I think it drains them a little bit with the hybrids. You know, if you've got the species, you need to be pedantic and stick to the rules, basically. But most of the nobly hybrids, they do like to cool down a bit in the winter. They do, if you can, give them brighter light. And also, once they finish growing, there's no point in feeding them, but they do like a trickle of water now and again to stop your latest growth shriveling, which reduces their energy and possibly could reduce their blooming. However, the cooling down a bit and the brighter light helps with the blooming. It's a nice balance you need to get with these. So finished growing for the year now. Did not achieve any full length canes this year. Far too much disturbance on the poor beastie. Taken from a specimen sized plant, hacked in half, repotted after the blooming when the new growths were underway, and that put a little bit of a break on. But nonetheless, we should get blooms on these two new canes, possibly on some, in fact I can see a bud. I can see buds. Sorry, this won't stand up. If you look at the top of the cane with the yellow leaves, you can see two buds there, one to the right and one right just underneath that dead leaf. So it's already coming into bud in places, which probably means it's going to have a stack of blooming, which will be a nuisance. On this year's growths, no sign of buds yet, but yeah, I can see some signs of buds. This cane here did produce a couple of blooms at the beginning of this year, but it hasn't finished. It's still got nodes that weren't used, so I'd expect to see some blooms here, and even on that tiny little old cane there we've got a couple of buds. I doubt if there will be any blooms from this old section of the plant back here, because as you can see, if you come down the nodes, every single one's been used, every single one. So highly unlikely to get anything unless there's just an odd one that it missed out. So the blooms will be in this section this year, and then it's got a good root system now. It's picked up quite nicely in this little pot. It won't stand up, but yeah, so next year it will be coming into growth as a reasonably established plant with a good root system. So we should get some good new growths, and hopefully next year they will grow to full size, and then we'll go from there. Beautiful blooms on this one. I like it a lot, but as I said, it got split. The biggest bit went to somebody else, and then another piece got torn off and sent to Insa because he was always drooling over it, and I thought, I'll blow it, I'm sure I can break another bit off and send it to him. So Insa's got one of these as well. They don't come up for sale very often. They used to. This one in amongst the nobly hybrids used to be around sort of I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, but I haven't seen it for sale for many years now. So those that are around are probably all there is. It just doesn't come up. So that's that one. So there we go then. That's the final part for the Dendrobiums chosen as Project Orchids. And I thought a nice way to end might be looking at one of the more spectacular ones this year. So literally Dendrobium glomeratum, not bloomed for about 3 years, has decided to give it a go this year, or this winter, with 2 nice bloom clusters on the oldest canes. And I got a feeling we got another one starting to follow on.
So it looks like something just kicked this off. It spent all that time not blooming and now it's decided to. So anyway, hope you're enjoying this, these final parts. 2 to go, and the other 2 will follow as soon as I can get them organised. I'm hoping to get them done before Christmas, but that might not take place. I've got other things to do because it's Christmas. Anyway, see you next time. Hope you're enjoying these. Bye for now.